Miss Marple and the Footsteps on the Thatched Roof. Chapter 1. An Afternoon Tea and a Scream in the Wind. It was one of those days that looked like something out of a watercolour. The sky softly covered with fluffy clouds, the air filled with the sweet scent of heather and freshly trimmed hedges, and the wind gently murmuring among the sloping rooftops of St. Mildred, a village where rarely did anything more dramatic occur than a dispute over the fluffiest cake at the annual fair. Mrs. Vicarage's back garden was bustling with people, china cups, and soft laughter. It was the traditional fundraising party for the People's Library, a custom as old as the walls of the church that hosted it. Tables decorated with starched white tablecloths were lined with gooseberry cakes, cream scones, and rhubarb tarts that glittered in the sun like edible jewels. Miss Marple, in her straw hat and white gloves, sat next to Mrs. Hartnell, who was enthusiastically reciting the juiciest details of the vicar's new gardener, a young man with strong arms and apparently a somewhat shady past in Liverpool. And they say he arrived with barely a suitcase and no references, Mrs. Hartnell murmured, her eyes narrowed as if sensing a scandal. And what do you think, Jane? Miss Marple sipped her tea delicately and looked towards the corner of the garden where the young man in question was serving lemonade to two excited old women. I think you know how to plant dahlias very well, my dear, she replied with a serene smile. And I'm not entirely convinced that coming from Liverpool is still a crime. Before Mrs. Hartnell could reply, an abrupt sound shattered the quiet afternoon. Scream, sharp, cutting, and completely out of place. The murmurs ceased as if someone had turned down the volume. A few cups clinked. Several faces turned toward the edge of the property, where a young woman was running along the gravel path, her linen dress flapping in the breeze. "It's Lydia!" exclaimed the vicar, dropping a half-eaten bun. The young woman stumbled as she reached the group. Her face was as white as whipped cream, and her hands were shaking violently. "On the roof!" he moaned. I saw someone on the roof of the thatched cottage, and there's blood on the window." A collective whisper spread among the guests, followed by a flurry of hurried footsteps. The thatched roof Lydia was referring to was the Turner's old cabin, a forgotten structure at the edge of the back garden, once used for storing tools. It had remained empty for years, save for spiders and dust. Miss Marple slowly but surely stood up. As the others rushed dramatically toward the scene, she headed in the opposite direction, discreetly skirting the side of the house toward a more distant perspective. She looked up cautiously. The thatched roof showed a faint, almost imperceptible trace of crushed straw moving toward the right edge. In the cabin window, barely visible through the reflections of the glass, there seemed to be a dark stain, or a shadow cast by the ivy. The screams continued, now mixed with exaggerated claims that someone had seen a hooded figure, that blood was still dripping, that Lydia was possessed by a vision. Inspector Cray appeared shortly after, summoned by a frightened gardener. He pushed his way through the crowd, accompanied by two constables. They entered the cottage cautiously. A minute later, the tension dissipated, but not entirely. "No one's home," Cray announced, "but there is something strange. A bloody handkerchief on the inside windowsill, and footprints on the ceiling, just like Miss Lydia said." There was a muffled murmur, A cloud slid past the sun. Miss Marple laced her fingers over her bag. What a curious scene, she murmured to herself. Footprints on a thatched roof, blood on a body, and a neatly folded handkerchief. Her eyes shone for a moment. No one noticed except perhaps the young gardener, who watched her from a distance with a slight frown. The afternoon had begun with tea and scones, but now the sweet scent of the garden seemed to mask something darker, a crime, perhaps, or the promise of one. Chapter 2. Gossip, Traces and Shadows. The scandal quickly took shape at St. Mildred's. By nightfall, the fundraising event had been forgotten, replaced by a vibrant new topic of conversation. The mysterious visitor from the roof and the bloody handkerchief conjectures sprang up like daisies in spring. In Mrs. Whittaker's grocery store, the rumour was that he was probably a thief caught red-handed. In Miss Nash's sewing room, it was said that he was the spirit of Thomas Turner, the cottage's last tenant, who had died 7 years earlier after falling from his own roof one stormy night. Meanwhile, in the small parlour of the Café La Rosa, some spoke of a jilted lover or a bandit taking refuge after a bloody fight in the countryside. Miss Marple, however, entertained none of these theories. The next morning, she walked quietly along the gravel path that bordered the church, as she usually did after breakfast. She nodded to the young gardener, who was carrying a sack of fertilizer, and stopped in front of the rose bushes to examine a broken branch. The most beautiful petals are often under constant threat, she commented softly, before standing up and continuing on her way to the Turner cabin. Inspector Cray had not yet resealed the scene, and a barely visible police ribbon hung listlessly between two hedges. Miss Marple paused a few steps before crossing it. Instead, she turned her attention to the roof, squinting slightly. The thatch had evidently been trampled underfoot. Fragments of it stuck out at unnatural angles. What was interesting was not just the existence of the footprints, but their path. Toward the east edge, not toward the window, but away from it, he murmured. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," said a voice behind her. It was Sergeant Willis, young, affable, with a permanent expression of bewilderment. "Ah, Sergeant, good morning. I was wondering if Detective Inspector Cray has determined whether the prints were male or female." Willis rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, we don't know yet. They seem light, but that doesn't mean much. The roof isn't solid. The inspector assumes the intruder cut himself coming in through the window. The glass had a small crack. And have you thoroughly checked the inside of the cabin? Yes. Apart from the handkerchief and an old dusty bench, there isn't much. Although Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Yeah, we found some dried flowers tied with string, hidden behind a loose panel. They don't look fresh. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Forgotten flowers. And do you know who would have left them there? Willis shrugged. Maybe Turner, or someone before him. Or Lydia, maybe. She used to play here as a kid. Oh, yes, Lydia. Miss Marple said nothing further, but her thoughts were whirling slowly around the clock. Lydia Brightwell, 19, orphaned at 14, the vicar's niece, brought up at the rectory. Intelligent, though somewhat prone to fantasy. It was she who screamed. It was she who claimed to have seen someone on the roof. Too convenient. Later, at the rectory, Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Ellery, the vicar's wife, while Lydia sat by the window, looking out over the garden with a melancholy expression. "Was horrible," the young woman said, breaking the silence. "There was a figure, I swear, dark, crouching, like a cat. And then the blood. I didn't imagine it." "Oh, I don't doubt it, my dear," Miss Marple replied sweetly, "though human eyes, when they're frightened, often see more than there is, or less." Lydia looked at her, frowning. Miss Marple didn't add anything more, but she noticed the slight tremble in the girl's fingers as she held her cup. Meanwhile, in Inspector Cray's office, an unexpected discovery was about to change the course of the investigation. The handkerchief found in the cabin had the initials embroidered on it in barely visible letters. "C.A." "It's not Lydia's," Cray murmured, "or the vicar's, or anyone else at the rectory." He looked at the handkerchief again, this time more closely. The blood, though dry, was still striking against the white. Who the hell is T.A.? Outside, the church bells pealed softly, and the wind blew hard, stirring the loose thatch of the forgotten roof. The mystery, Miss Marple thought as she returned home, was still in her prologue. Chapter 3. One Initial, Two Memories. The afternoon sun fell on St. Mildred's with a golden glow that gave the cobblestone streets an almost nostalgic air. Despite the peaceful atmosphere, the town was bustling inside. The discovery of the bloody handkerchief, now linked to someone with the initial C.A., had sparked new speculation. Some claimed it belonged to a secret visitor. Others spoke of a former resident who had returned with a vengeance. In the small haberdashery of Mrs. Penelope, Dawes, a petite woman with sharp eyes and a high-pitched voice, the topic had even overshadowed discounts on embroidery thread. "I'm telling you, Jane," she murmured to Miss Marple, who was looking at buttons more intently than she seemed. "The only C.A. I remember around here is Charles Ashcombe. Do you remember him? The one who worked in the carpentry shop with your father before he went north?" "Oh, yes, young Ashcombe," said Miss Marple without looking up. "A fair-haired lad with very light eyebrows and an ill-tempered manner. He left shortly after. Gladys Webb's wedding?" "Exactly," Penelope agreed with a suggestive little smile, "and just before that it became known that she was pregnant." Miss Marple nodded slightly, as if contemplating the right button for a navy blue sweater. "And has anything been heard from him again?" "Nothing. Not a letter, not a whisper. But if you ask me, some grudges don't age well." That night, as the sky turned ashen, Miss Marple settled into her parlour with a cup of lime tea and her crocheted work. The fire crackled softly, but her thoughts weren't of the wool between her fingers. She was thinking of Charles Ashcombe, of Gladys Webb, of the thatched roof. The roof! Too fragile for someone of such a large build. The footprints were light, and the figure seen, according to Lydia, was agile, almost feline. A man like Charles, or a woman? The next morning, she decided to take a walk to the village cemetery. Not as a pious visit, but because one of St. Mildred's most silent observers worked there. The gravedigger, Albert Croft. With his slow gait and weathered face, Croft was like a human oak tree. He didn't say much, but he saw everything. "Good morning, Albert," Miss Marple said. "The jasmine by the wall is particularly beautiful this year." Albert looked up from a tombstone he was painstakingly cleaning. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Yes, Flowers know when to be quiet, I suppose." She smiled approvingly at that sentence. "Tell me, haven't you noticed anyone hanging around the Turners' old cabin lately? Anyone who's not from town?" Croft was silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded, slowly. "A woman. I saw her from a distance a few nights ago. She walked with a firm stride, wearing a grey hat and a long coat. I couldn't see her face. But she stopped in front of the cabin and stood there for a long time. She didn't go in. She just watched. When was that exactly?" 2 nights before. Young Lydia's scream. Miss Marple nodded her thanks and left without further ado. That, more than anything else so far, whispered to her that the crime, if one had indeed occurred, was not an impulsive act. There was planning, discreet visits, a link to the past. That same afternoon, Inspector Cray called a small informal meeting at the rectory. Lydia was present, along with her uncle the vicar, Mrs. Ellery, and, with a somewhat awkward expression, the young gardener Thomas Blake. Cray was forthright. "The investigation is ongoing, but we need honesty. Does anyone recognize these initials?" He showed the handkerchief with the letters CA. No one answered. Lydia shook her head, her eyes slightly misty. "Could it be a recent visitor?" Cray asked. The vicar sighed. There were no strangers, except for Mrs. Alton, who came from Surrey to visit her cousin. But she left the very day of the party. Miss Marple sat discreetly in a corner chair, watching. When Lydia's eyes met hers, the young woman instantly looked down. Nervous or guilty? At the end of the meeting, Miss Marple approached the inspector in a low voice. "If I may make a suggestion, Inspector Cray, perhaps you are not looking for the wrong person. But the wrong type of connection." Cray looked at her, clearly intrigued, but Miss Marple simply smiled at him and said goodbye. Outside, dusk had tinged the rooftops with orange hues. At the edge of town, a hooded figure paused by the red mailbox. He dropped a neatly folded letter into the mailbox and walked away without looking back. The letter was addressed to Lydia Brightwell. Chapter 4. A Letter to Dawn. The next morning dawned with a soft mist that seemed to settle like a veil over St. Mildred's, silencing footsteps and blurring the lines between houses, trees, and rooftops. From the window of her room in the rectory, Lydia Brightwell gazed out at the garden. With a lost expression, still dressed in her linen nightgown, she held between her fingers a letter with no return address, carefully folded in white paper. She had found it that morning in the mailbox, with no stamp or return address. Only her name, written in an old, firm hand. He sat on the edge of the bed, read the letter for the 3rd time, and then slowly folded it. His face was pale, but not from surprise, more from the silent recognition of something long feared. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mrs. Ellery was vigorously stirring the jam in a jar, while remarking to her husband that Lydia seemed more distracted than usual. The vicar, busy polishing his glasses, muttered something about the nerves of youth, and returned to his task without looking up. Just a few streets away, Miss Marple was knitting in her living room with the steady rhythm of someone who thinks faster than she acts. She hadn't missed the letter. A village boy had seen it slide through the slot the night before, though he hadn't been able to clearly see the face of the person who delivered it. But the detail that had caught Miss Marple's attention most was the paper itself. White, thick, and unmarked. Old-fashioned correspondence paper, the kind that hasn't been sold at St. Mildred's for years. That morning, she decided to visit Miss Nash, the local dressmaker, under the pretext of checking an old ball gown that needed alterations. But her real interest was the dressmaker's brother, Clive Nash, a retired librarian and obsessive collector of stationery and old stamps. "Oh, yes, Jane, dear," said Clive, excited to see a sample of similar paper Miss Marple showed him. This style was produced by Whitworth and Sons in the early 1930s. The texture is unmistakable. I bought almost all my samples in vintage lots, although I did sell a few envelopes to a woman a few months ago. I can't remember her name, but she had a grey hat with a crooked feather on it. Would you say she was a stranger? Definitely. He had a southern accent, I'd say. He wasn't from the county. Miss Marple nodded gratefully and said goodbye. The picture was beginning to take shape, but it was still like looking at a tapestry from too close a distance. You could make out the threads, but not the complete pattern. Meanwhile, Lydia had gone out for a walk, the letter neatly folded in her coat pocket. The wind tangled her hair as she crossed the field between the rectory and the Turners' old cottage. No one else seemed to be around. When she reached the cottage door, she stopped. She looked at the rusty lock, still bearing fresh marks from being forced. He knelt down, as if searching for something in the grass. A silver glint caught his eye. A small, discreet tie clip with an initial carved into it. She held it between her fingers, uncertain. Then she stood up when she heard footsteps behind her. "Lydia?" The voice was masculine, soft, and came from down the path. Thomas Blake, the gardener, appeared with an expression of surprise that seemed a little too restrained. "I didn't expect to find anyone around here," he added, walking toward her. "This place is more abandoned than the old train station." Lydia clenched the pin in her fist and forced a smile. "I just needed air. Sometimes it's easier to think here." Thomas nodded, looking up at the thatched roof. Air or memories? She didn't reply. Instead, she put the pin in her pocket next to the letter and mumbled something about returning before lunch. Thomas watched her leave, his expression hard to read. Once alone, he walked to the side of the cabin and, unnoticed, pulled something wrapped in cloth from behind some bushes. He quickly stuffed it into a duffel bag and disappeared down the opposite path. At that same hour, Miss Marple was returning home, after leaving a note at the rectory requesting a talk with Lydia. She didn't insist on seeing her immediately. She knew that the replies didn't come in a hurry, but with carefully observed silences. That night, as the village slept and the fog gently returned, someone lit a candle inside the Turners' old cabin. Through the broken glass, a silhouetted figure could barely be seen, crouching over something that looked like a case or box. The candle trembled, and with it the promise that what was buried at St. Mildred's would not remain hidden much longer. Chapter 5. A Case Under the Dust. The next morning arrived with an unusual clarity, as if the sky had decided to lift the mist that had covered it. In St. Mildred, however, the clarity was only superficial. Beneath the surface of courteous greetings and daily routines, something was stealthily stirring. The villagers' faces were more attentive. The doors were slightly more ajar. And in more than one passing conversation, the words cottage, blood, or mysterious letter were mentioned. Miss Marple had eaten breakfast in silence, watching the sparrows fly about in her garden while she pondered recent events. There was something disturbingly delicate about this case. Too many small pieces, like loose beads from a necklace that had broken long before anyone noticed its absence. And above all, too many repressed emotions. Mid-morning, a messenger from the vicar left a note on her doorstep. Lydia had agreed to meet her. Tea was served in the rectory's conservatory, a warm room scented by the begonias and hydrangeas climbing the walls. Lydia, perched on the edge of a chair, seemed made of taut threads. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "I've received something that perhaps you should see." From her bag, she took out the letter. Miss Marple took it carefully, as if afraid the paper might disintegrate when touched. She didn't read it immediately, but studied the fold, the paper, the writing. Finally, she unfolded the sheet. The content was brief. "Lydia, you can't keep ignoring what happened. He hasn't forgotten, and neither should you. Someone else knows. Someone who won't keep silent." C.A. Miss Marple looked up. "Who is he?" "Lydia." The young woman trembled slightly. I'm not sure, but I have an idea. Years ago, when I was a child, there was an accident, a game that ended badly. But we hid it. They made us promise. Who were we?" Lydia hesitated. "Charles, Ashcombe, Gladys Webb, Iyo." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And he was injured." Lydia brought a hand to her face, as if trying to erase a memory. "Yes, his name was Alec Farley. He was 12 years old. He lived at the end of the road with his mother. One afternoon, something happened at the cabin. No one wanted to talk about it. Soon after, they moved out. They say Alec never fully recovered." Silence fell over the greenhouse, interrupted only by the buzzing of a bee trapped between the glass panes. "Do you think this letter is from Charles?" Lydia asked. Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Her eyes were fixed on a leaf outside, blown by the wind. "I don't know, dear. But I do know that fear ages letters faster than paper." That afternoon, Inspector Cray went to the cabin. The candle found by an officer during a night patrol had caught his attention. Who lit candles in an abandoned place? "It doesn't make sense," he grunted as he shouldered open the door. Inside, the air was thick and earthy. Sunlight filtered in thin lines between the wooden slats. The cabin seemed empty, until Cray noticed something. A small trapdoor in the floor, previously hidden by an old rolled-up rug. Opening it, he descended into the space beneath the floor, little more than a hole lined with damp planks. And there, covered in rags and dust, he found a small worn leather case. He carefully took it out. It was flat and elongated. He opened it cautiously. Inside, carefully protected by faded velvet, was a halo card, a miniature portrait, a young woman with a flower-shaped brooch, and a small rusty pistol. Cray frowned. On the back of the portrait, hand-scribbled, are a few words, "So you don't forget what we did." Cray put away the case and left the cottage. On the threshold he met Miss Marple, approaching with her firm step and attentive gaze. "Inspector," she greeted. "Anything interesting?" Cray thought about it for a moment. Then he showed it to her. Miss Marple examined the contents with a gravity she rarely displayed. "A memory frozen in velvet," he murmured, "and a threat disguised as a memory. Do you think Lydia is in danger?" "I do," said Miss Marple, closing the case, "but I also believe she's not the only one." That night, someone knocked loudly on the back door of the rectory. When the vicar opened it, he found only a small wooden box wrapped in a grey scarf on the threshold. Inside, a note with 3 words, "You remember." Chapter 6. Echoes under lock and key. The wooden box was still on the rectory dining room table when Miss Marple arrived at dawn, discreetly summoned by the vicar. The grey scarf had been carefully folded, and the note with those 3 words, "You remember," lay beside it as if awaiting careful perusal by someone who could decipher more than just the writing. "Did they touch her?" Miss Marple asked as she entered, adjusting her gloves. "Just to open it," the vicar replied. "It didn't seem dangerous, but I preferred not to touch anything else." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. She bent over the box. It was simple antique with brass hinges. She gently opened the lid, revealing the contents. Inside, a carved wooden figurine. A boy in a sailor hat, his eyes painted blue. It was broken. One arm was missing. Beneath it, a photograph bent around, the edges. It showed 3 children in front of the Turner's cottage. One of them, clearly Alec Farley, stood in the centre, smiling shyly. On one side, a dark-haired girl, Lydia. On the other, a tall, skinny boy, whom Miss Marple recognised as Charles Ashcombe. All 3 were holding hands. But the image, though endearing, had something disturbing about it. The barely visible background showed a rope tied to a tree, like a playground tether, or something else. "Do you remember Lydia?" Miss Marple asked softly. The young woman sitting in a corner of the room didn't respond. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the wooden figure. "We played adventures," she finally whispered. "Charles was the captain, I was the nurse, Alec was the prisoner, always the prisoner." Miss Marple approached and knelt before her, as if she wanted to see her from the exact height of her memories. "What happened that day, Lydia?" The young woman trembled. "We tied Alec to the tree, like always. But this time, Charles said it had to be real, that a real prisoner had to prove his worth. We blindfolded him. He didn't complain. I brought stronger rope from the shed. He stood still, waiting. And then Charles left. He said he wouldn't be back for hours. That would make the game real." He paused, breathing heavily. "I was scared, not for Alec, for me. I ran home. When we came back hours later, he was gone. He'd let go, or someone had let him go. He never spoke to anyone. They say he started stuttering after that, and that his mother took him far away." Miss Marple took her hand. "And now someone wants you to remember it." At that moment, Inspector Cray, who had also been summoned, arrived. He looked at the contents of the box with a frown. "This isn't just a threat anymore. It's a reminder. And not for just anyone. For someone specific." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but not just for Lydia. I think this box was also intended for Charles, and maybe for himself, for the sender. Do you think Alec is back?" "I think someone wants us to think about it," she replied. "But I also think this someone knows the story too well. Details that only one of the three of us could know." Cray crossed his arms. "So we're talking about a guilty person, or a victim who wants justice." Miss Marple looked at the wooden figure. The lines were clumsy and childish, but at its base, almost illegible, were some hand-scraped letters. "Of 1939. Not a threat," she murmured. "A message from someone who never stopped remembering." That afternoon, Cray ordered a review of municipal records. One unexpected discovery turned out to be a woman named Annabel Farley. She had quietly rented a cottage on the outskirts of St. Mildred's just 3 weeks ago. Widow, discreet, with a sick child, they said. Miss Marple asked to accompany the inspector, not out of curiosity, but because she sensed the thread was getting tighter toward the end. The house was half hidden by ivy, the windows covered by thick curtains. A woman with white hair tied back in a bun opened the door. Her large, clear eyes showed no surprise. "I knew they would come," he said simply. "You can't hide pain for so long without it coming back." He led them inside. The house was simple and tidy. In the living room, an easel held a half-finished painting. It depicted the roof of the Turner's cabin under a grey sky. "My son is sleeping," Annabel said, her voice breaking. "He can't speak, but he understands. He always understood. He didn't come back to hurt anyone, just to remember, so he wouldn't be forgotten." Miss Marple approached the easel and touched the painting carefully. Was he the one who wrote the letter? Annabel shook her head gently. "No, it was me. He never would have had the courage, but he deserved more than silence." Cray cleared his throat. "Mrs. Farley, was your son at the cabin on the day of the recent incident?" She hesitated for a second, then she nodded. "I wanted to see, just see." He heard the girl's voice. He got scared. He put down the handkerchief. Nothing more. Miss Marple watched her silently. "So, if it wasn't him, someone else is playing with what you wanted to bury." Annabel blinked. "Anyone else? Someone who knows too much, and who's just taken the first step." That night in the town square, someone tacked a sign to the bulletin board. It didn't say anything. It just showed the same old photograph, with Lydia and Charles's faces marked with a red cross. Chapter 7. The Red Crosses. The poster was discovered shortly before dawn by the baker, Mr. Hobb, who, upon opening his shop, found the village notice board adorned with a large yellowed sheet of paper. Held down with rusty thumbtacks, the old, weather-worn photograph showed the 3 children, Lydia, Charles, and Alec. This time, however, something was different. Above Lydia and Charles's faces, a red cross, drawn in thick ink or paint, stood out like a stark warning. By breakfast time, all of St. Mildred's knew. Miss Marple was one of the last to arrive at the stage, not out of disinterest, but because she knew that the most revealing scenes occurred when the crowd had already dispersed, leaving only traces of what they were really thinking. "It's a threat," Mrs. Hartnell muttered, her hat askew and her indignation well ironed. "This is nothing but sick vandalism. What if it's not a threat?" Miss Marple said softly from beside him. "Sorry, what if it's a warning? An Internal warning? For them, not for us. Mrs. Hartnell pursed her lips uncomfortably and walked away. Miss Marple leaned toward the poster. The ink used for the crosses still looked fresh. Not paint, but something more oily. Perhaps permanent marker. A modern instrument, not something pulled from a dusty trunk. That, to her, was key. Whoever did this wasn't nostalgic. It was someone active, someone planning their next move. Inspector Cray arrived minutes later. He looked tense, his jaw clenched. "Someone left this overnight," he said unnecessarily. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, just this picture. "It's not just a photograph," Miss Marple replied. "It's a signal, a continuation of the previous message, and now it's aiming more precisely." Cray nodded heavily. "I've sent an agent to look for Charles Ashcombe. He's in Little Davington, according to the records. A carpenter. He's been there for years. And Lydia? In the rectory, under surveillance. But he still denies having enemies." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Sometimes enemies aren't born out of hatred, but out of shared guilt. Later, Lydia was formally interviewed in the presence of the vicar. When the poster was shown to her, she paled, but she didn't scream, nor did she cry. "I don't know who could have done this," he said, his voice dry. "But if Charles is in danger, we must warn him." "We've already sent someone," Cray replied. "They'll arrive tonight." Lydia looked down. "Maybe it's already too late." Miss Marple didn't intervene. She watched the tremble of the teacup Lydia was holding, the subtle movement of her lips as she said, "Charles." And she remembered what hadn't been said yet, the feelings that, in childhood, weren't understood, but that left deep marks. That afternoon, while Cray was questioning old acquaintances of the Ashcombes, Miss Marple decided to visit a place that few in the village considered relevant, the old St. Mildred's. School now closed, but with its records still in the possession of Mr. Felgrove, the former headmaster. "Oh, yes, of course I remember Alec Farley," Felgrove said, leafing through an old attendance book with trembling fingers. "He was a quiet child, slow with some studies, but very observant. There was something, as if he always heard more than he seemed to. He was teased, of course. And Charles Ashcombe?" Miss Marple asked. "A natural leader. One other kids follow without question, sometimes cruel without knowing it." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "And Lydia? Sweet, but she always seemed to want to please someone in particular." He left the former director's house with a certainty that was already beginning to form. The roles in that old photograph weren't as innocent as they seemed. Prisoner, captain, and witness. Alec, Charles, Lydia. Not just a game, but an emotional triangle whose consequences were still unfolding. That night, just before sunset, came the news everyone had been dreading. Charles Ashcombe was not in Little Davington. He had left his workshop 3 days earlier. No one knew where he was going. His house was empty. His clothes were untouched. His bed was unused. Inspector Cray banged his fist on his desk. "He's vanished!" Miss Marple, sitting opposite him, was unfazed. What if it wasn't him who disappeared? "What do you mean? Maybe it wasn't him who ran away. Maybe it was him who went to look for something, or someone." Cray looked at her with a mixture of frustration and respect. "Do you think he knew about the poster. Maybe. Or maybe he received another message we don't know about. Outside the police station, the wind blew with unusual force, shaking branches and making the windows of the old houses creak. In the distance, the silhouette of the Turners' cabin remained motionless, but a dim light flickered inside as if someone else had gone back inside. And on the ground in the rectory's back garden, buried just beneath the eaves of a hydrangea, an anonymous figure was dropping a second, still unhung sign. This time, I only had one cross and a handwritten name, Jane Marple. Chapter 8. A cross for the observer, the discovery of the name. Plate didn't alter Miss Marple's pace or her rhythm as she prepared breakfast the next day. She didn't even raise her voice when she informed Inspector Cray that she had found a leaf carefully buried in the back garden, right under the blue hydrangea that always bloomed before the others. It was dry, unwrinkled. Someone took their time, she explained, helping herself to a modest slice of bread and butter. It wasn't an impulsive act. It was a calculated warning. Cray frowned as he held the sheet of paper between latex gloves, a black cross, more pronounced than the previous ones, wider, and beneath it, in thin but firm ink, Jane Marple. Do you think this is a direct threat? No, Inspector, not exactly. It's a warning, not to me but to the others, she replied calmly. Someone wants me to step back, to stop watching. Cray crossed his arms. So you don't know him well. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Fortunately, that same day, the entire village was informed. The news spread with the speed of a dry barn fire. Most people reacted with disbelief. Who would threaten? Miss Marple? The same one who had solved the problem of Mr. Prentice's poisoned cake. The one who discovered the parish stamp thief. The effect was immediate. The murmurs in the church pews turned into nervous glances. Doors, previously left ajar out of courtesy, were bolted. Mrs. Dawes, the dressmaker, left a note in the shop saying, "Closed due to sudden illness," although several witnesses claimed to have seen her watching from upstairs with binoculars. That same afternoon, Lydia asked to speak privately with Miss Marple. "I can't take it any more," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is getting away from me. I feel like someone is getting ahead of us all the time." They were sitting in the living room of Miss Marple's house, where the ticking of the clock was the only steady sound. "You're not alone," the old woman assured her. "But we need to know more. Charles is still missing, and every step we take seems to be accompanied by another one in the shadows." Lydia nodded, her eyes moist. "I remembered something else," he said, after a pause. "On game day, when we tied Alec up, Charles gave me something. He whispered it in my ear with a smile. He gave me a small key. He said if anything happened I should hide it, that it would be our way out." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows attentively. "And what did you do with it?" "I hid it in a biscuit tin I buried in the rectory garden near the old rose bush. I forgot about it until now." Miss Marple asked to be taken to the place. Despite the dampness of the earth, the box was still there, buried with childish clumsiness. Upon opening it, they found the key, small, brass, along with a green marble and a crumpled piece of paper with the word "Storm" written in black ink. Inspector Cray was summoned immediately. "Do you recognize the key?" he asked, holding it with tweezers. Miss Marple examined her briefly. It's not from the cabin nor from the rectory. It's older, and if I'm not mistaken, it belongs to a piece of furniture, probably a desk, with a false bottom, if Charles was as clever as he seems." Cray nodded. It could be the turner's desk, the one that was in the cabin before they abandoned it. They headed toward the cabin together, escorted by 2 officers. The air inside was damp, heavy with dirt and old memories. In a corner, under a threadbare sheet, the desk leaned on one leg. After removing it, the lock on a side drawer seemed to match the shape of the key. With a dull click, the drawer opened. Inside, more than just papers awaited him. A dusty leather folder contained old letters, rudimentary maps of the terrain behind the cabin, and most curiously, a list of names. Names from the town, including Lydia Brightwell, Charles Ashcombe, and Alec Farley. Next to each name, a date, and beneath them all, a single word: reunion. "This is a setup," Cray muttered. "Someone planned this a long time ago." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "And the game we thought was buried has just started again." That night, a hooded figure crossed the path that connected the cabin to the woods. He was carrying something in his arms, a rectangular box sealed with rope. Upon reaching a clearing hidden by fir trees, he buried it with trembling hands, and as the earth covered the secret again, he left behind a note pinned to a stone. One more before the end. Chapter 9. The Glade of Reunion. At dawn, Detective Constable Cray received a call from Detective Constable Barnes, assigned to patrol the forest trails outside St. Mildred. He had found something. Not a body, as some had feared, but a recently buried box in a clearing hidden among fir trees, just over 20 minutes from the Turner cabin. A stone lay in the disturbed earth. A simple note. One more before the end. Cray arrived at the scene with Miss Marple. The still damp soil made digging easier. The rectangular light-coloured wooden box was sealed with waxed string, but not padlocked. When it was opened, everyone gasped. Inside were seemingly unrelated objects. A metal spinning top with a faded inscription, a school ribbon in the saint, Mildred's colours, a piece of broken mirror wrapped in newspaper, and a carefully folded letter. The inspector opened it wearing gloves. Memories to be forgotten. Fragments that no one wanted to keep. But one of them speaks. One still holds the reflection. The last one will come for him. Before the end. This isn't just a threat anymore, Cray said, looking at Miss Marple. It's a carefully constructed play. Someone has been planning this for a long time. She nodded, looking at the objects. The fascinating thing is that each of these elements seems meaningless, until you look at them with the right eyes. And what are those eyes? Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Those of someone who played with these objects. Someone who knows what they mean to others. They are pieces of memory, Inspector. But more importantly, they are pieces of blame. That same morning, the vicar received an unexpected visitor. A postman delivered an unstamped letter with no return address, written in black ink on blue-lined paper. The envelope read only, "For the heart of silence." The vicar, perturbed, handed it directly to Miss Marple. Inside, the letter was addressed to the three who remained silent. One of you wouldn't look. One of you tightened the rope. One of you ran away before the scream. But I heard. I saw. I don't forget. And this time I won't be the prisoner. This time the game will be mine." Miss Marple read it twice, silently. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "This isn't just about Alec Farley anymore. This isn't the voice of a victim seeking justice. It's the voice of someone who witnessed it and decided to intervene." Cray nodded. A fourth player? Or someone who wasn't part of the game? But observed it. Maybe a sibling, or even someone who found the cards and decided to act on them. Are you saying Alec isn't behind all this? I say that whoever moves the pieces now does so from Alec's shadow, but not with his trembling, but with precision, with calm, and with cruelty. Later that day, a call came in from Little Davington. A farmer reported seeing a thin-set man with a stubble and a grey hat wandering around the abandoned station. He didn't seem dangerous, just confused. He said he was looking for a cottage with a gold roof. Inspector Cray left immediately. Miss Marple, however, stayed in the village. She had another address to visit. The old Farley family home, empty for years, but still maintained by the parish estate. It was said that no one had touched it since Annabel and her son left. But upon entering, he noticed the opposite. The air wasn't that of an abandoned place. Someone had been there. Recently. The curtains had been drawn. The dust on the floor had irregular footprints. And on the living room table there was a handwritten sheet of paper. "Jane Marple, you listen, you see, but you don't know how to play. You'll soon understand why the ropes tighten themselves when no one wants to look." Miss Marple slowly closed the note. As she stepped outside, she saw someone crossing the opposite street, hidden under a light-coloured trench coat. He walked with an erratic gait, as if he were hesitating between fleeing and staying. When she called out to him, the figure disappeared behind the walls of the old cemetery. He didn't follow him. It wasn't the time. That night, Inspector Cray returned without having found the man from the station. No sign of him. Just a sentence scribbled on a wooden bench. "The truth is in the game. The end is in the rope." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. The circle was narrowing. It was no longer just the past knocking at the door. It was the present demanding justice or punishment. And somewhere in St. Mildred, someone was preparing for their final move. Chapter 10. The Game on the Last Rope. Chitu, no. Silence that enveloped St. Mildred the next morning was different. It was no longer the peaceful stillness of the countryside, but a tense pause, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The streets were empty earlier than usual. The shutters were firmly closed. Even the church bells seemed softer, as if respecting an unspoken fear. Miss Marple, however, maintained her routine. She ate a leisurely breakfast, watered her geraniums, and then sat by the window with a notebook in her lap. Not to write, but to observe, because the truth, as she well knew, wasn't always in what was said, but in what one avoided looking at. Mid-morning, he received a visit from young Agent Willis, sweating, hat in hand. "Miss Marple, they've found him." She looked at him without surprise. Where? In the old bell tower, the one that hasn't been used since the new tower was installed. A boy saw it from the field, hanging. He paused. "But it's not dead. Miraculously, no. The ropes gave way. Miss Marple stood up with a deep sigh. Who? Willis thought about it for a moment. Charles Ashcombe. The scene in the bell tower was like something out of a bad dream. Charles lay on the wooden floor, unconscious, but alive, his neck bruised, his lips parched. There were clear signs of a struggle, and on his wrists, signs of having been tied up. Beside him, someone had left a carefully folded sheet of paper, secured with a nail in the window frame. 2 escaped the game, but the game is unforgiving. 1 more is missing. Then, silence. Inspector Cray, pale and frustrated, held the paper as if it were an unsolvable riddle. Miss Marple, who had arrived just a few minutes later, read it silently. Then she looked at Charles, unconscious on a makeshift stretcher. Do you think he tried to take his own life? No, she replied. This wasn't a suicide attempt. It was a performance. A message. From the same one who's been leaving the letters. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The author wants us to see everything as part of a work. But he's not improvising. He's executing something he's had in mind for a long time. And now it's clear to us who his real target was. Cray frowned. Charles? No, the game inspector. This punishment isn't personal, it's symbolic. Charles was the captain, the one who devised the rope, the one who ran the game, the executioner, so to speak. But there's someone else who hasn't paid their price yet. And according to this note, all that's left is 1 more. Lydia. Yeah. That afternoon, young Brightwell found herself locked in her room at the rectory. After learning of the attack on Charles, she didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just asked to be left alone. The vicar agreed, concerned. Mrs. Ellery, nervous, left a tray of tea and biscuits outside the door, but Lydia didn't touch it. Hours later, when Miss Marple arrived, she found the tray still intact. She's not answering, Mrs. Ellery murmured. I've called her twice. She's locked in. Miss Marple came closer and knocked gently. Lydia, dear, it's Jane. May I come in? There was no response, but after a moment of tense silence, a click on the other side indicated that the lock had been released. The door opened slowly. Lydia sat in front of the mirror, her face pale. The original letter, that first one with no sender, held between her fingers. This is all my fault, isn't it? He asked without turning around. No, my dear, said Miss Marple, advancing towards her. No one can carry the shadows of the past alone. But what matters is what the present demands. And now it demands the truth. Lydia turned her head slowly. I know who's behind this. I always knew. But I didn't want to say it. I thought, if I kept quiet, it would all be over. And yet the silence fueled the fire, Miss Marple murmured. Lydia nodded. Is called Eliza Farley, Alec's sister. She never played with us, but she followed him everywhere. Always quiet, always behind. I once heard her crying outside the cabin, the afternoon we... Chapter 11. The Face in the Mirror. The clearing yawned between the trees like a moonlit wound. The night breeze stirred the high branches with a constant murmur, as if the forest itself sensed that something ancient and not entirely resolved was about to emerge. In the centre of the clearing, next to the small mound where the box had been found days before, someone was waiting. He wore a grey cloak, his face covered by a dark wool scarf. But his eyes, visible under the moonlight, showed no fear, only determination. Miss Marple and Lydia moved forward slowly. Despite the tension, the old woman seemed perfectly calm, as if she were keeping a long-awaited appointment. The figure slowly raised its hand and spoke. They arrived together. That makes me happy. The voice was feminine, soft, but laden with an icy tone. It wasn't a shout or an accusation. It was the voice of someone who had been rehearsing every word for years. Lydia stopped, her breath coming in short gasps. "Eliza!" The woman removed the scarf. Her face was gaunt, but recognizable. Her hair, darker than her brother's, fell straggly over her shoulders. She had deep dark circles under her eyes and pale lips. In her arms she held something covered in a white cloth. "I didn't come here to do any harm," she said, addressing them both. "Though you did, many years ago." Miss Marple stepped forward. "They didn't kill Alec, Eliza, and you know it." "No," she answered coldly. "But they broke him. They broke him from the inside out, and I had to watch him fade away day after day, word after word. He never spoke properly again. He never trusted anyone again. He died with his eyes open, as if he were still waiting for someone to come back for him, and they never did." "We were children," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "We didn't even understand what we were doing. I didn't mean to—" "You wouldn't look," Eliza interrupted, with more pain than anger. It wasn't the rope that hurt him. It was loneliness, betrayal, oblivion. He opened the cloth he was carrying. Inside was an oval mirror in an antique frame. It was cracked at one corner, but still reflected clearly. He placed it on the floor, upright against a stone. This was hers. She used it to look at herself when she couldn't speak, as if she hoped to find in her reflection the words she was missing. But all she saw was her silence. Miss Marple stared at the mirror without moving. "And now you want someone else to look at him," he said softly. "To face what he did." Eliza nodded, still looking at Lydia. "I just want you to see it, Lydia. I want you to see it the way I saw it. Tied up, alone, waiting. I want you to say it, to speak out loud what happened." Lydia swallowed, took a step forward, and knelt before the mirror. She stared at herself in it for a long minute. Her reflection stared back at her mercilessly, her red eyes, her tense face, her lips trembling. "I left him there," she said in a faint voice. "I heard his sobs, and I didn't go back. I was scared. I was scared of Charles. I was scared of what we had done, and I ignored it. I thought if I forgot, he would too. I thought time would heal him." A tear fell on her hands, but he didn't. Eliza closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the raw ice in her gaze had shattered, leaving only tiredness. That was all. "I didn't want revenge, just truth." Miss Marple walked slowly towards her. "Sometimes the soul doesn't need punishment, just recognition, just knowing that what happened wasn't a delusion or a game without consequences." Eliza took a deep breath. Then she squatted down beside the mirror and wrapped the fabric around the frame again. "I'll leave at dawn," he said. "No one needs to see me any more. But now I know that Alec isn't really gone." Lydia walked over and took her hand. I stay here with you for a moment?" Eliza didn't respond with words. She just nodded. Miss Marple, her heart heavy, turned around and walked back down the path. She walked slowly, leaving behind the clearing and the shadows that had haunted it for so many years. That night, for the first time in weeks, the wind, blowing across the thatched roofs, didn't seem to bring threats, but relief. But when she got home, Miss Marple found a letter on her entrance table. There was no envelope or signature, just a folded sheet of paper with a sentence written in neat handwriting. "Sometimes he who observes too much is also observed." She read it silently, then folded it and put it between the pages of her notebook. The case was over. But not all eyes had stopped watching. Chapter 12. The Silent Game Ends. Over the next few days, St. Mildred's regained, at least in appearance, its usual tranquil rhythm. The bells rang regularly again. Parishioners returned to the pews, and teacups once again clinked amid quiet chatter and subdued comments. Yet beneath that calm, there still lurked a sense of something not quite resolved. Charles Ashcombe was taken to the county hospital, where he awoke disoriented but with no permanent injuries. He refused to speak to police beyond a simple statement. "They summoned me there. They told me Lydia was in danger. When I arrived, they hit me from behind. I didn't remember anything else." Eliza Farley was not arrested, on Miss Marple's advice, and, after a psychiatric examination, she was determined not to pose a direct threat. Her behaviour was understood to be the result of years of suppressed trauma and unprocessed grief. She left the village at dawn, as promised, leaving behind a single farewell letter addressed to Lydia, which she read silently and then burned in the fireplace without saying a word. It seemed like it was all over, but Miss Marple was not satisfied. One afternoon, a few days later, he sat down with Inspector Cray in the small office at the local police station. Spread out on the table were all the letters, the objects from the clearing, the poster with the red crosses, and the last note found in his own house. "Inspector," said Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap, "something still doesn't add up. The planning, the symbols, the theatrics. It all seems the work of a meticulous mind. But Eliza Farley isn't that kind of person. She's intense, yes, damaged, certainly. But her way of acting was emotional, visceral, not intellectual, not elaborate." Cray stared at her. "Do you think she wasn't the one who designed all this? I think Eliza was part of the outcome, but not the design." He took the last note out of his bag. "Sometimes he who observes too much is also observed. This message isn't meant to threaten," he said. "It's meant to point out that the game is still going on, albeit more subtly." Cray exhaled, frustrated. "So who?" Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Instead, she bent down and took out a folder she'd brought with her. Inside was a small envelope with yellowish paper. This letter was found in the cabin's hidden desk. It had gone unnoticed, stuck to the back of the drawer, and it contains something curious. He handed it to the inspector. The envelope was empty, except for a single line. "Look at the one who never played, but was always there." Cray frowned. "Who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Someone who saw, who heard, who grew up among secrets and learned to move pieces without being seen, someone like the gardener. Thomas Blake. Cray blinked. Blake? But why him? Orphaned as a child, adopted by the parish. He grew up in the shadow of Lydia, Charles, and Alec. Always present, never invited. He was the cook's son. He played on the fringes. He witnessed more than anyone imagined. And most importantly, he is left-handed. And what does that prove? Miss Marple opened another page, the one with the red crosses. The marks were thick and diagonal, all with a line running down from right to left, typical of someone left-handed. And Thomas Blake, as she had noticed, used garden shears with his left hand. He was the one who found Eliza first. He was the one who manipulated her. He offered her the cards. He told her about the game. He ignited her pain. He gave her the tools to begin. And then he stayed in the shadows, waiting. Cray jumped up. Where is he now? They found him at dusk in the Turner cabin. He was arranging tools as if nothing had happened. When he saw Cray and the officers, he didn't run away. He just looked up and said calmly, "I thought it would take longer." Cray handcuffed him without a word. Miss Marple watched him from the doorway, silent. "Why?" he finally asked. Thomas looked at her. His young but hardened face displayed a disconcerting calm. Because no one remembered him. Not him, not me. I just wanted someone to listen, someone to see. You saw him, didn't you? She nodded slowly. Yes, Thomas, I saw. Days later, St. Mildred's was back to what it had always been. A place where gardens bloom without questioning what happened underground, where teacups never cool even when past tragedies are discussed, and where, as always, an old woman sits by the window, knitting not only with wool, but with memories. Miss Marple closed her notebook. She had noted every clue, every gesture, every unspoken word. Then she put it back in the drawer, next to a small faded photograph of 3 children in front of a cottage. The past had spoken, and this time the game was over.